Well, hello, Raymond and friends, and what an enormous pleasure it is to address this joint rally of Germans for Yes and Netherlands for Scottish independence, an indication of the degree of support that Scotland and Scotland's aspirations as a European nations have across the continent. Now, before we look forward in the political situation that Scotland faces now, well, let's look a bit backwards, because it is an indication of Scotland's links and Scotland's history as a European nation. Now, in 1297, as we all know, that Scotland won a surprise and unexpected victory. Maybe looking forward to the European Championships, who knows? We might win another surprise and unexpected victory on the football field. But in 1297, in the battlefield of Stirling Bridge, William Wallace, a brave heart, Andrew de Murray, his co-commander, won a surprise upset victory over the English armies of Edward I. Now, what interests me about that piece of history is what happened in the immediate aftermath of the battle. Did they have a celebration ceilidh? Did they all say, my goodness, Scotland have won, let's go out for a drink? No, what actually happened is that Wallace and de Murray, as the joint guardians of Scotland, wrote a letter, sometimes called the Lubeck Letter, to the Hanseatic League, which basically, and I paraphrase from the Latin, said, look, there's been a change, Scotland is now open again for business, we're now back in charge, and we'd like our trading concessions re-established immediately. Because the Hanseatic League was, if you like, the medieval equivalent of the European single marketplace. And it was crucially important for the economy of Scotland, the economy of the Low Countries, the economy indeed of the Netherlands and Germany. And when Scotland and when Scots were back in charge of their own trading requirements and their own country, the first thing they wanted to do was to re-establish these European connections. And the reason for saying and telling the story is it illustrates that 700 years ago, as now, Scotland was a European nation. And Scotland was a European nation that was struggling once again to have open relationships with the community of nations. So I take the support of Germans for Yes and Netherlands for Scottish independence as being a long historical tradition of support for Scotland's right as a nation in the European continent, and support in Scotland to re-establish our direct relationships with our friends in Europe. So in Netherlands for Scottish independence and Germans for Yes, you are part of that long tradition. So what can you do now to help Scotland's cause? In the aftermath of the elections, for the fourth time running, there is a clear mandate to move to another test of Scottish independence. And at some stage, I hope quickly, but at some stage, the Scottish Government is going to pursue that, and at some stage, that request, that demand is going to be rejected. As sure as eggs are eggs by Boris Johnson, he's going to say no. So at some stage, the Scottish Government is going to employ tactics to try and persuade the Westminster Government to change its mind, to allow Scotland the right of self-determination, the right to express ourselves as a nation. And at that point, then the support of our colleagues and friends across Europe is going to be critically important in forcing Westminster's hand. I don't need to tell anybody in this audience how deeply unpopular Boris Johnson's anti-European Tory government is across Europe. Some people say that the disappointing results for Britain and her entry in the Eurovision Song Contest was another indication of that deep unpopularity. It might just have been a rubbish song, of course, but nonetheless, it's an indication that Westminster is struggling for friends in Europe at the present moment. Scotland isn't struggling for friends, but we need to make sure we mobilise our friends in pursuit of Scotland's democratic rights. So far from being just interested observers, Germans for Yes and Netherlands for Scottish independence are going to be required and necessary as part of the adherents, the people who are cheering Scotland on, the people who are mobilising the international pressure that's going to be part of the campaign to force Westminster to grant Scotland the right that any nation should have and must have, the right of self-determination. So don't see yourselves just as spectators, or even just supporters of Scotland, but key parts of the international network that's going to be required at some point in the very near future for Scotland to force onto the agenda our claim for nationhood and allow that expression to be tested once again in a democratic verdict of the Scottish people. Over the last 700 years, the means of expressing Scottish identity has changed. We are now in the democratic era. But the democratic era requires ballot box opportunities, and it requires everyone, including the Westminster government, to respect the right of nations to self-determination. That's a clear right, well understood, acknowledged and enshrined in the United Nations Charter. It's one that's understood in Germany and the Netherlands. It's one that's understood in Scotland, and we've got to make sure our collective efforts have that right understood in London. So the political strategy that's going to be required, that certainly Alba as a party will be contributing to, is going to have to be one that's sustained and determined if we are to force Westminster's hand. But it's one that certainly will include the mobilisation of our friends across Europe. And therefore, it's why I'm particularly delighted to be addressing this event today, to make sure that we don't just keep a light on for Scotland and Europe, but that light burns strongly, burns brightly, as Scotland's right of self-determination is acknowledged in Europe, and even low unto the depths of Westminster government, that the means of expression of self-determination is something that is granted to any nation, and a right that any nation, and this Scottish nation, can exercise when it so chooses. And with that, Raymond and friends, thank you for listening, thank you for participating, and above all, thank you for your interest in this ancient European nation of Scotland.